He wore a badge, carried a gun, and swore to protect his community. But in 2019, the small town of Oxford, Mississippi was shaken to its core when one of its own officers, Matthew Kinne, was exposed not as a protector, but as a cold-blooded killer. This is the tragic and shocking story of the murder of Dominique Clayton and the dark truth behind the uniform. Dominique Clayton was a 32-year-old mother of 4. Loving, vibrant, and known by everyone in her neighborhood, she was also in a secret relationship with Officer Matthew Kinne of the Oxford Police Department. Their relationship wasn't public. Why? Because Kinne was a white officer, married with children, and Dominique was a black woman from a working-class neighborhood. They kept things quiet. But Dominique confided in family and friends that she hoped Kinne would leave his wife and build a future with her. But behind the scenes, the relationship was falling apart. Dominique began to suspect Kinne was stringing her along, and she started threatening to expose their affair to his department and his wife. And that's when things turned dark. On May 19, 2019, Dominique's 8-year-old son walked into their home and found his mother dead, lying face down in her bedroom with a single gunshot wound to the head. It was a horrifying discovery that would scar the child and the family forever. Police were immediately called to the scene, but what they didn't expect was that one of their own was the prime suspect. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements began to point in one direction. Officer Matthew Kinne had used his patrol car, while off duty, to go to Dominique's house in the early morning hours. Once inside, while she was sleeping, he executed her at close range and left. Authorities moved quickly. Within 48 hours, Kinne was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case sparked outrage across the country, not just for the brutal killing, but for the abuse of power, racial dynamics, and the apparent attempt to keep the relationship secret at all costs. As the trial date approached, the community demanded accountability. In 2020, Matthew Kinne chose to plead guilty to all charges, avoiding trial and admitting to murdering Dominique in cold blood. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was a father, a police officer, and a man sworn to protect his community. But behind the uniform, Bobby Cutts Jr. was hiding a terrible secret, one that would shock an entire nation. This is the true and heartbreaking story of Officer Bobby Cutts Jr., a man who turned from public servant to convicted killer. It began in June 2007 in Canton, Ohio. Jessie Marie Davis, a 26-year-old woman who was 9 months pregnant, suddenly vanished. She was a caring mother, expecting her second child, and her family knew something was wrong when she stopped answering her phone. When police arrived at her home, they found unsettling signs: furniture knocked over, her 2-year-old son home alone, telling investigators, "Mommy's in the rug." The entire community began searching for Jessie, hoping she'd be found safe. But as days passed, suspicion began to fall on Bobby Cutts Jr., her ex-boyfriend, and a Canton police officer. Why? Because Cutts was the father of both Jessie's first child and the baby she was about to deliver. Their relationship was complicated. Cutts was married to another woman, and sources revealed he feared the scandal of another child with Jessie would destroy his career and family life. Then, the truth came crashing down. On June 23, 2007, Bobby Cutts Jr. confessed. He admitted that he had killed Jessie during an argument, and with the help of a friend, dumped her body in a remote park. She was found buried in a shallow grave, still carrying her unborn daughter. The news devastated the community. A police officer, who people once trusted, had not only committed murder, but had killed the mother of his own children and his unborn child. Cutts was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, abuse of a corpse, and other related felonies. In 2008, after a widely followed trial, Bobby Cutts Jr. was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 57 years. This case left a deep scar, not just on the families involved, but on the image of law enforcement. How could someone with a badge, trained to protect, commit such a brutal and selfish act? Jesse's death became a symbol of failed relationships, domestic violence, and abuse of power. Her family, especially her mother and surviving son, have spent years coping with unimaginable loss. To this day, the case of Bobby Cutts Jr. stands as a harrowing reminder. The uniform doesn't always represent what's inside. Sometimes the danger isn't on the streets. It's behind the badge. He was a rising star. A former college football player turned police officer in Oklahoma City. Daniel Holtzclaw looked like the American dream in uniform. But behind his badge, he was hiding one of the most disturbing patterns of abuse in modern U.S. law enforcement history. This is the true story of Daniel Holtzclaw, a man who used his authority not to serve, but to prey. In 2013, Holtzclaw joined the Oklahoma City Police Department, patrolling some of the city's poorest and most vulnerable neighborhoods. At 6'1", 260 pounds, he was physically intimidating, but no one suspected he would weaponize that presence against the very people he was supposed to protect. But over time, disturbing patterns emerged. Women began coming forward. One by one, they described eerily similar encounters. They were stopped by Holtzclaw late at night. He would ask them to step out of the car, search them without cause, or take them to isolated locations. Then came the ultimatums: comply or face arrest. Many of these women had prior records or were involved with drugs, and Holtzclaw knew they were less likely to report him. But one woman did. In June 2014, a 57-year-old woman reported that Holtzclaw forced her to perform sexual acts during a traffic stop. That complaint opened the floodgates. Police began digging into Holtzclaw's patrol logs, GPS data, and body cam footage, and the picture became horrifyingly clear. Investigators linked him to 13 African-American women, all of whom alleged they were sexually assaulted, groped, or raped by Holtzclaw while he was on duty. He wasn't just abusing power. He was selecting his victims based on vulnerability, race, and silence. The case went to trial in 2015. Holtzclaw faced 36 felony charges, including rape, forcible oral sodomy, and sexual battery. His defense? He claimed the women were lying to avoid legal consequences and denied all wrongdoing, but the jury didn't buy it. In a landmark verdict, Daniel Holtzclaw was found guilty on 18 counts and sentenced to 263 years in prison. The courtroom was filled with emotion as each verdict was read. Some jurors cried. So did many of the women, finally vindicated. The Holtzclaw case sparked national outrage, raising serious questions about police accountability, systemic racism, and how many other officers might be abusing their power in silence. It also exposed flaws in the justice system. Holtzclaw was allowed to continue patrolling neighborhoods during the early part of the investigation. Internal oversight had failed, and until one woman spoke up, no one had listened. To this day, Daniel Holtzclaw maintains his innocence and has appealed his conviction. But for the victims and for the community, justice was served. He wore a badge, swore to serve and protect. But behind the closed doors of his Long Island home, Officer Michael Valva became the face of a nightmare. This is the tragic true story of a police officer who let his own son die in the cold. Michael Valva was an NYPD officer living in Center Mauritius, New York, with his fiancée Angela Polina and his 3 young sons, including 8-year-old Thomas Valva, a boy with autism. But instead of love and care, Thomas was subjected to abuse that would eventually lead to his death. According to investigators, Thomas and his brother were forced to sleep in the unheated garage of their home, sometimes in freezing winter temperatures. They were starved, beaten, and emotionally tormented, all while their father, a police officer sworn to protect others, stood by, or worse, participated. On the morning of January 17, 2020, Michael Valva called 911, claiming his son Thomas had fallen and hit his head. But when paramedics arrived, they found the boy ice cold, barely dressed, and unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The cause of death? Hypothermia. Thomas Valva had been locked in the freezing garage overnight, with no blankets, no heat, and no chance. As the investigation unfolded, a shocking pattern of abuse and neglect was revealed. Home surveillance footage captured Valva and Polina mocking and yelling at the kids. At one point, Valva was recorded saying, "He's cold? Boo freaking who?" The community was horrified. The NYPD suspended Valva, and prosecutors charged both him and Polina with second-degree murder and child endangerment. During the trial, heartbreaking testimony and disturbing footage painted a clear picture. This wasn't an accident. This was systematic abuse. In November 2022, a jury found Michael Valva guilty of murder and endangering the welfare of a child. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. In 2023, Angela Polina was also found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life. The death of Thomas Valva shocked the entire nation and led to calls for child welfare reform in New York State. Many people questioned how signs of abuse were overlooked, even after repeated complaints from Thomas's biological mother, Justina Zubko Valva, who had long warned the courts that her children were in danger.